comes to new things being added to Battlefield 1, I'm usually all over it. I like to analyse whether the community ideas could fit into the setup that DICE has created for this game. And when it came to the new CTE dog tags, I spotted something that I think could be a very good fit for the Apocalypse DLC, the last expansion coming to Battlefield 1. DICE has already revealed that that expansion will focus on unique weaponry and brutal tools, leading me to think they're going to blur the lines even further surrounding World War I with what was actually used and what was more concept and prototype. The first ever British prototype tank, called Little Willie, could well fit right into that description. Now, as I said, this tank was recently spotted on one of the new CTE dog tags that's soon to be added to the main game, and I think at this point in time it refers to the prototype testing that DICE conducts on the CTE. Often updates and new things that find their way onto those servers don't make it into the main game, and to symbolise that, DICE has stuck the Little Willie tank on one of their dog tags. That's my theory anyway. But let's go one step further. Could this often forgotten British creation really make it into a future DLC? Let's start to analyse that possibility by taking a look at what the tank was and how it came to be. In early 1915, as a response to the deadlock that had set in on the Western Front between the Germans and the Entente powers, the British War Office commissioned a Landships Committee. Their main focus was to design, test and produce an armoured vehicle that could be used in mainland Europe before the end of 1915. The initial brief was to create something that could break down the German barbed wire. Rather than sending out groups of soldiers into the night to cut the wire and create paths through no man's land, the vehicle would simply flatten and destroy the defences, and that would allow the soldiers to follow behind and take the trench lines that so far couldn't be reached. Not to mention, an armoured vehicle taking the brunt of German machine gun nests wouldn't have gone amiss. The amount of soldiers that were lost to those alone was far too high, and something needed to be done to limit casualties. The Landships Committee offered out the contract to various firms in England, and the contract was won by William Foster & Co. of Lincoln. He was instructed by the committee to commission a double-track prototype machine capable of traversing a 1.5 metre wide trench line. Now, you have to remember at this point that the word tank hadn't been coined by any nation, although most nations in the war were working on armoured vehicles of some sort. That's why most of the tanks you see in World War I are so vastly different. It wasn't a real thing at that point, and sort of any army had to do what they thought was the right thing to do. So in Britain, experiments with agricultural vehicles first were conducted. These vehicles were suited to the rutted landscape that was starting to form in northern France. Things like tractor tracks were used on some very early designs, but they were found not to be sufficient at holding the weight of an armoured hull being designed to protect the soldiers who'd be inside the armoured vehicle. The very first prototype of what would become known as Little Willie looked like this. It had straight, uncovered tracks that were taken directly from a Daimler tractor, along with its engine. The rear tail wheel was added to provide better steering, as the engine driving the tracks wasn't sufficient to move the vehicle forwards at a fast enough rate. So to help with the steering, that thing was added on the back. It's worth noting that all of these vehicles were basically resigned to a very slow top speed, sacrificing that for manoeuvrability and protection on the battlefield. The initial trials that took place with this very early design, known as the Lincoln Machine No. 1, they helped the Landships Committee really think out what they wanted from this vehicle. New tracks were sourced for the vehicle, as the Daimler ones were found to be too flimsy, and they weren't long enough to give the hull enough stability whilst it was moving. And the dummy turret on top of the hull, not that you can see it in this picture, you can see it here in this sort of mock-up of the design, that was removed, and they favoured side-mounted machine guns instead. A crew of 2 would drive the vehicle, accompanied by 4 machine gunners using Masson-mounted guns. Moving from the Lincoln Machine No. 1 to Little Willie, Here are the final designs. On the left you can see the number 1 machine, and on the right, Little Willie. You can see the similarities, but there are definitely some differences there. Now, Little Willie, in its final design, was considered successful by the committee, but the Lincoln company that made it weren't entirely happy with its overall design. So, an idea was pitched to have the tracks of the vehicle run all the way round the hull to give it as much length as possible. The British might not have envisaged that behind the German front lines there were deeper defences they needed to try and get across. The iteration in the track design from the Lincoln Machine number 1 to Little Willie had been for that exact reason, so that it could try and get across bigger and bigger obstacles. And that was what essentially sealed the fate of Little Willie. Whilst it could have seen combat, it was ultimately superseded by another design, which I think you'll be very familiar with if you've played Battlefield 1. That design placed even higher emphasis on the obstacles that it had to cross. The new design was known as Mother, and it became the Mark I British tank. And it employed a full hull track design, and it managed to mount 57mm cannons on either side of the hull. That's something that Little Willie had to have removed. This second Mother prototype was favoured by the committee, and it was commissioned to be built for adoption into the British Army and used on the front lines in France. Further iterations of this iconic lozenge design were made, with the War Office designating the tanks different genders. Male tanks were fitted with those cannons on the side and machine guns, and the female tanks just with machine guns, but more than what were fitted to the male tanks. Little Willie also influenced designs of another British tank that was used during World War I, the Whippet. This tank was designed to support the heavier Mother tanks at the time, pushing forward in front of them to confuse enemy soldiers with just pure machine gun fire. Now, I've managed to make it all the way through this commentary without laughing at the name Little Willie, but there is some reasoning as to why this name was chosen for the prototype. At the time, of course, the different nations in the war wanted to keep the enemy out of their secret projects, so any mention of specifics had to be covered up. And as I mentioned earlier, the word tank hadn't been coined by anybody, so of course nobody was calling them tanks, but it was the British who first used the term when they were trying to confuse their enemy, leading them to think of water tanks, which were common on the front lines. The name Little Willie came from Crown Prince Wilhelm of Germany. Many British newspapers had used the name to mock him in their articles. And the Mother prototype, which became the Mark I tank, that was also nicknamed, this time Big Willie, in reference to Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany. Both names were jokes, but at the same time, they were likely making reference to what they were built to destroy, the German Empire. So that's what Little Willie did for Britain in the war. It basically paved the way for the Mark I tank that we know did turn the tides of battle at some points during World War I. But could it possibly come to Battlefield 1? Well, I'd like to think there's some space for it. As I mentioned in the Apocalypse DLC, there is clearly an opportunity for prototype items to make their way into the game. We already have plenty of them in Battlefield 1, so a DLC dedicated to that is not all that surprising. And the DLC is set to focus on some of the most infamous battles of World War I. The Battle of the Somme was the first recorded use of tanks during the war, with the British deploying their Mark I tanks against the Germans. Besides the point that the majority of these Mark I tanks broke down or never even made it to the front line, there is an opportunity here that DICE could allow Little Willie, the first tank ever made and completed, a place in an alternate history where it takes to the battlefield alongside British soldiers pushing back against the Germans. Think of the Shah 2C Super Heavy tank that DICE added to the They Shall Not Pass DLC. That tank never saw any combat during World War I either, yet it found its way into the game anyway. I think the same thing could happen for Little Willie in the Apocalypse DLC, and the Somme battlefield would be a fitting place for it to play a part. But what do you guys think? Am I being crazy and just trying to justify something that's a bit too far-fetched to really happen, or am I onto something with this prototype British tank? Let me know down in the comments section, and maybe even leave some of your own suggestions down there too. Of course, I will be reading as many as I can. But until next time, my name is Westie, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.